Choosing the Royal Gold Medalist is, I guess, one of the highlights of an RMBA President's Year. This year, our jury consisted of a highly talented group of people, so David Chipperfield, Louisa Hutton, Eric Parry, and Frederick Migo, and I was chairing. So first of all, I'd like you to join with me in thanking them for their hard, if not pleasurable work. I just wanted for a moment just to speak personally, because for me, Joseph Rykwert's work has always placed a concern for people at the heart of his thinking. Whether it's in the way our rituals and ceremonies have come to define our cities, its buildings and spaces between them, or more recently in the seduction of place, reinforcing the need for constant community participation and involvement. But it's that work and that human content of his work which I have been always really quite enamored by, because really as architects, how people experience and engage with architecture is absolutely central to our consideration. The medal represents a well-deserved award to a person whose writing has changed the way we think about history and about our cities. And you can see versions of the film interview with Joseph by our head of awards, Tony Chapman, on architecture.com and on the RIBA journal website very soon. Of course, Joseph's name has been carved next to the handful of the most recent recipients on the lintel above the entrance to our new architecture gallery, which opened just 2 weeks ago. And if you've not had the chance to see the Brits Who Built the Modern World exhibition, please do so soon. So tonight, Joseph Rykwert has been presented with one of architecture's most prestigious prizes, the Royal Gold Medal. The medal is presented to a person or group of people whose influence on architecture has been truly international. And I'm now going to ask Eric Parry to read his citation on behalf of the Honours Commission. Eric.
Now in your 88th year, your body of published work is by any standard extraordinary in its consistent intensity, relevance, and ongoing influence. We can easily take for granted your enrichment in today's debate about our environment when confronted by the span of your career. In 1949, you were introduced by Siegfried Gideon to the president of SIAM, Cornelis van Esteren, at their 7th gathering in Bergamo as our young revolutionary. And it's fitting that in a way you can return the compliment, as he was an early source of inspiration. You are one of a handful of historians and theorists to have received this award, and whilst your reputation places you in the camp of the builders of architects, rather than the designer of buildings, you are at heart an architect. You began your training at the Bartlett in 1942, at that time evacuated to Cambridge. Then moved to the AA, worked for Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew, followed by Richard Shepherd and then Obeara. Later, you designed a housing development with Mark Livingston at Inner Court, Old Church Street, which was recently reviewed for listing and received considerable local and national support against demolition. And so, quite naturally, next to your writing desk, you have always maintained a drawing board. Your principal books have changed the way architects, planners, and urban theorists think about buildings and cities, and more fundamentally, how historians view the architectural roots of our era. The first manifestation, after a fascinating intellectual journey, was the idea of a town, published in 1963. You conceived it at a time when product design and empirical sociology were thought to offer the solutions needed to solve the problems which building after the destruction of the war required. It was a critical response to the picturesque ideas of the townscape movement, the formal preoccupations of both the brutalists and the techno-utopians, and the anarchic cries for the dismantling of the post-industrial city by groups like the Situations. In the idea of a town, you drew together two critical strands of investigation, that of the social, political and artistic history of the Italian town, so often cited as precedent by practitioners and theorists, together with an anthropological investigation of how society related to the fabric which it created and was subsequently conditioned. On Adam's House in Paradise followed 9 years later in 1972, exploring against the grain of fashion the idea of the primitive hut in architectural history. 8 years later, in 1980, the weightier The First Moderns brought a radical freshness to the well-trodden paths of 17th and 18th century architectural scholarship. It represented in part the fruit of 13 very influential years as Professor of Art at the University of Essex. The postgraduate seminar on the history and theory of architecture that you began there in 1967 was the first of its kind anywhere, and it is harrowing to reflect that the architectural authorities at the time wanted it suppressed. Francis Yates, an older contemporary of yours at the Warburg Institute and a brilliant scholar, praised the First Moderns lavishly. The range of Rykwert's learning is enormous. History of gardens, Chinese influences, festival architecture all contribute to the overflowing wealth. Great figures in the history of thought and science, Bacon, Newton, Vico, are seen from new angles. This is no superficial history of styles, no conventional history of ideas. It invigorates both through the attempt at a new kind of history of architecture. Amongst those who figure in your acknowledgements for the First Moderns are some of your students: Yoshihide Akahosi, David Leatherbarrow, Solomon Kaufman, Moisen Mostafavi, and Alberto Perez Gomez. Their subsequent careers, and many, many others, are witness to the fertile ground you and your teaching partner Dalibor Vesely helped to create for them. As a demonstration of that range which Francis Yates remarked on, in 1982 you published The Necessity of Artifice, which drew together 18 previous essays, spread over a period of 25 years. They all sparkle with a common ground of your perceptive analysis of the human condition and of individual creativity. You made your first trip to Italy, a country and culture that has gripped you since then, with John Turner, with whom you shared both an architectural and political affinity. John Turner, who later was to publish The Freedom to Build. Apart from the thrill of the best contemporary design and an easy flowing contact with a host of important figures, it was, as you have put it, the unexpected grandeur of St. Andrea Mandura that conquered me entirely on that first visit. It led to a series of collaborative projects, translations, commentaries, and advocacy of Alberti's greatness. In 1988, you published your translation, undertaken with Neil Leach and Robert Taverner, on the art of building in 10 books. Following this, in 1994, you created with your wife Anne and Robert the major exhibition of Alberti's life and work, held in the Palazzo Te Mantua. A larger space of time separates the First Moderns from the Dancing Column on Order in Architecture, published in 1996. During the intervening period, you moved from the University of Essex to the University of Cambridge, where in 1979 you had delivered the Slade Lectures. In 1988, you were appointed to Paul Philippe Krepp Professor at the University of Pennsylvania, a position you held until 1999. If On Adam's House was in a sense a response to the wide breadth and scope of the idea of a town, so the Dancing Column is to the First Moderns. In the former, you examine the Western world's changing attitudes towards the classical orders since antiquity. In the latter, your scope is to examine the growth of the associations of the words classic and classical as they apply to architecture, through the ground of revolution, objectivity, enlightenment, and equality. The Dancing Column has been widely acclaimed. Frank Gehry calls the work staggering. claiming, "I can't stop reading it," whilst leading academics were similarly impressed. Frank Gehry is one of no less than 7 previous gold medalists who have supported your nomination. With Faustian precision at the millennium, in the light of the global glut of city-making, you produced The Seduction of Place, the history and future of the city, which you conclude by inverting the line, "Make no small plans," taken from Daniel Burnham, the author of the vast Chicago Plan of 1909, into "Make little plans and lots of them." Most recently, in another dialogue of scales, you published The Judicious Eye, Architecture Against the Arts. The Europe we know is a relatively stable political entity. 2012 marked the 50th anniversary of the Franco-German reconciliation, signed by Chancellor Adenauer and President de Gaulle and Rheims. The political context of your youth could not have been more different. Warsaw was the epicenter of the growing political storm of the 1930s. With a maternal lineage referencing pre-revolutionary Russia as a cultural precedent and an Anglophile father, you vividly remember your family's nervous laughter at the menacingly comical broadcasts of one Adolf Hitler, and at the same time the living terror experienced at first hand by your father of communist Russia. You have coped admirably well. Seed sown at Charterhouse School, succored by the dazzling intellectual firmament of Warburg, and thereafter very much on your own path and of your own making. Your first review, that of Siegfried Gideon's Mechanization Takes Command, published in 1948, took you 2 years to complete. No doubt drawn out by your need to have fully grasped the material. That same tenacity and wisdom underlies all your work. Let the last words of the citation be Susan Sontag's. Joseph Rykwert is a gloriously erudite, ingeniously speculative historian and critic of architecture, of, that is, the forms in the most concrete sense of civilization, of social embodiment itself. Joseph, congratulations and thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that wonderful tribute. I'd now like to invite Joseph Rykwert to come on stage for the formal presentation of the Royal Gold Medal. Joseph.
It is said that the applause after Stalin's speeches always lasted so long because nobody dared to be the first to stop. But at this point, I really do feel rather naked. And the only word that comes to mind is, of course, thank you. But before I say any more, I would like to make that thank you concrete. by giving your idea as a present. This is the manuscript of the seduction place. Firstly, Craig, for this wonderful introduction which left me almost naked, but it was nevertheless a wonderful summary which I certainly couldn't have done for my life. And of course, I need to thank Providence for having kept me in one piece and more or less compost until this very moment. And I thank all my friends, and I thank, of course, all my pupils who have been so rewarding throughout my life. And perhaps I should just end by saying that anyone who knows me knows that everything that I write with, by my wife, Anne, who is here, and to whom I owe more thanks than I can say.
Joseph, on behalf of RIBA, I just want to thank you for the wonderful and gracious gift of the selection of plays. As you probably gathered, it's one of my personal favourites. It's really heartfelt. And of course, that will now go into